All right, Congress. When we look at Congress, we just assume sometimes that that is the option that the Founding Fathers had when they created a legislative branch, was to create a Congress. That wasn't the only option. They could have also selected a parliament. They rejected a parliament for a number of reasons, which we will get into. So what we want to first look at is the difference between Parliament and Congress. So you see over here, we've got, on the left column, we've got who does what. So party selects candidate for office. In a parliamentary system, the party selects the candidate. That's just how it works. In a congressional system, the party does not select the candidate. It is an individual's own decision whether or not he or she wants to run for Congress. But in Parliament, you actually have to be selected by the party. If you are not selected by the party, you just don't get on the ballot. Remember, as we talked about when we talked about political parties, in a parliamentary system, assuming, let's say there is 100 seats in Parliament, each party would nominate 100 individuals to be part of Parliament. If their party were to win 100% of the votes, they would then receive all 100 seats. So they nominate, or they select candidates based on the number of people in Parliament. If they get 50% of the votes, they get 50% of the seats. But in a congressional system, it's not a party decision as to who runs. It's the individual who decides whether or not he or she wants to run. In a parliamentary system, parties vote together on almost all issues. That is just the way it is, and then there's part and parcel. Part of the reason for that is because the party selects the candidates in a parliamentary system. If you don't vote the way your party wants you to in a parliamentary system, they just won't nominate you in the next election. You just won't have a seat in Parliament. Because members of Congress don't owe allegiance to their party as to whether or not they run, they don't necessarily vote with their party on most issues. There's genuine choice in Congress as to which way a member of Congress will vote. They don't have to toe the party line. The legislative body selects the executive. In a parliamentary system, yes, and in a congressional system, no. So I'm going to go to the next slide before we even finish this, so to try and explain this portion right here. All right. So remember, we're talking about this issue that the legislative body selects the executive. In a parliamentary system, the reason that's so, in a parliamentary system, the legislative and executive branch are really one. What happens, as you see right here, if you look at this diagram right here, it shows the legislative and executive branch are one. Whereas in a congressional system, the legislative branch is independent of the executive branch, and the executive branch is independent of the legislative branch. What happens in a legislative branch, remember what we just said, that in a parliamentary system, if there were 100 members of parliament, each party would select 100 individuals that they would nominate for parliament. Whichever party gets the most, gets a majority of seats in parliament, they are the majority party. They have the right to choose the executive. The executive in a parliamentary system is known as the prime minister. So on that list of 100 people, or however many seats there are in the legislature, the top individuals on that list would really be the party leaders. The individual who is number one would likely be the prime minister if that party receives a majority of votes in the elections. So the prime minister is chosen from the majority party in parliament. If there is not a majority, that's when they make those coalitions that we talked about when we talked about political parties. Consequently, because of that, in a parliamentary system, the prime minister's party always has a majority. If he doesn't have a majority, if he loses a majority on, there's something called a vote of no confidence. If he or she loses the confidence of their party, what happens is the government is dissolved and there has to be new elections. So it is a big deal not to vote with your party. You're cutting your own throat and you're cutting your party's throat if you make this vote of no confidence. So in a parliamentary system, Prime Minister always has a majority in Parliament or in their legislative branch. In a congressional system, the President may or may not have a majority of his party in Congress. And this is why you have Donald Trump, Republican, being president. You have the House controlled by the Democrats right now, and the Senate controlled by the Republicans. So what you have is what's known as divided government, where the president cannot count on a majority of votes in Congress. Now, even when a president has a majority of votes in Congress, it doesn't, meaning his party, it doesn't mean his party is always going to go along with him or her, because we are a congressional system. So it matters then, going back to this slide, it matters what kind of government is chosen. And so the framers opted for this government because, going back again to here, this is a very powerful government when you have the legislative and the executive branch fused into one. This becomes a weaker government because the executive has got to get the legislature to go along, or vice versa, with the other party, and there's going to have to be negotiation and compromise and give and take. Now, this diagram right here, what I've tried to do is shown a Venn diagram, but I can't find anything on Word that lets me do this. So technically speaking, this line would come down right here, and you'd see this overlapping of powers between the executive and legislative branch. Nevertheless, they are still independent. All right. So the framers of a parliamentary system, did they design it to be weak? And the answer in a parliamentary system is no. That, again, going back to this, when you have the executive and the legislative branch fused, there's always a majority. They can do whatever they want. When you have the legislative and executive branch separated, there is not always a majority. One can check the other, which is illustrated right here. But in a congressional system, it is designed to be weak for the reasons we just showed. Now, the importance of individual members based upon large staff and resources. Parliamentary elected officials, for the most part, except for the party leaders, the people right at the top of that list, are going to be unimportant. But each member of Congress is important. Take, for instance, a member of the House of Representatives will have a budget somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 million every year. With that $2.5 million, he or she will have a staff in Washington, D.C., and they will have a staff in their home office. They have just a well-equipped office in Washington, D.C., and a well-equipped office in their home state, in their district, commanding many resources, able to do things. A member of the Senate has a budget of over $6 million and has, again, an office with many staff, probably about, in some counts, are as high as 30 and 40 staffers. They also have a couple staffs in their home state, particularly if it's a big state. And it matters what they think. It matters what they think because they don't necessarily have to toe. They don't have to toe the party line on votes. They're real independent persons. They have now. That's a member of Congress. Now let's take a look at a member of Parliament. You'll see the difference. A member of Parliament, it is said, they'll be lucky if they have a telephone, an office, and a desk, and a filing cabinet. They'll be even more lucky if that's all in one place. They just don't command the resources that a member of Congress does. And the reason they don't command resources is because they don't even decide whether or not they're going to run. It's the party leaders, people who are at the top of that list of 100, that make the decision who's going to run, and therefore the people on the lower end better toe the party line. Otherwise, they're just never going to keep their spot in Parliament. Members of Congress, though, they have to appeal to the voters. It's the voters that matter, and because of that, that is why their vote is so important. They're going to vote on almost all issues the way the folks back home would want them to. Now, there's a caveat to this. Sometimes the folks back home themselves are divided. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the lecture here. All right, we're going to stop. No, we'll go one more slide here. I got time. So what were the objectives of the framers in creating a Congress? They wanted to oppose concentration of power in a single institution. So as you saw with Parliament, it's right here. Everything, the legislative and the executive branch, powers concentrated. Whoever is prime minister, they're going to have a majority, and they're going to be able to do what they want. So the founding fathers, having the abuses of George III, said, we don't want to do that. We want to oppose that concentration. Not only that, not only did they oppose the concentration, they then divided the the Congress into two houses. So you have a Senate and you have a House of Representatives. And legislation not only needs to get through the legislature, but you can put a line right here, and there's a Senate over here and there's a House over here, and both of them have to do the same thing in order for it to even go to the president to be signed into law. All right. They also wanted to balance the large and the small states. There was a division between the large and the small states at the congressional at the Philadelphia meeting, Constitutional Convention. The large states had certain issues in common. Small states had other issues in common, largely representation. And so they needed to balance the large and the small states, and that's why you had the division of these two houses, and you get the Great Compromise from that. Furthermore, one of the things that we sometimes forget today is that Congress was designed to be the dominant branch or the dominant institution of government. You look at what happens today, you would think that the president is the dominant branch of government. And there's a number of reasons why we think that. One, the president's always in the news. He's always in the media. And that's more of an issue. It is just easier to cover one individual than 535 members of Congress. Everybody knows who the president is. So it's easy for the media to focus in on the president. The reality is nothing happens unless Congress passes a law. Congress is where the real power is at, despite the fact that we see it another way today. This does not mean that the president doesn't have any power, and there's a couple issues that have militated towards power going to the president that used to not be there, but is certainly there today. And we'll talk about that when we get to the president. All right, we're going to stop this one right here. When we get back, we'll pick up with this issue right here, selection of members of Congress.